Gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Combat Veteran Breakdown Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, Twitch streamer sometimes, podcaster. I'm doing a lot now. But this is going to be one of those topics that I've noticed is really popular whenever it gets covered in any of the videos, and that is about being in the military and having a relationship. Now, okay, you have relationships with a lot of people. You have a your boss is a relationship, your subordinate, a relationship. I mean romantic relationships, right? Obviously. But not obviously, right? And so dating in the military as a single guy, right, as a single straight guy, that's sort of the perspective that I'm taking. Obviously, things are way different if you are gay, if you're a woman, right? No two people and no two bases are going to be alike. So I'm going to share my experiences, but that's just kind of, one person talking about things. And hopefully you guys can get some insight over what this sort of dating environment, this strange dating environment looks like. So the 2 points to understand that sort of influence everything else I'm going to talk about is, first, the military, despite its considerable efforts to improve the diversity of its recruitment force, still skews heavily male. I think the latest stats that I saw, and these are probably a couple years old, was that the Army is around 85% men. So that, of course, means that there's, 4 men for every 1 woman, something like that, around there. So obviously, the dynamics of workplace relationships are pretty fraught. Now, the other thing that I think is really important to understand is that military bases are located often in land or areas that the government could not get rid of to anyone else. So that means that often they are not proximate to major urban areas. They're not proximate often to population centers. It's just sort of a fraught. I mean, they're sometimes in extremely unpopulated areas, and more likely just in areas that are a bit outside of where you would conventionally go. And this, too, is sort of a spectrum, right? In fact, both of these categories sort of occur on a spectrum. Yes, 85-15 is the average across the Army, but if you are in, say, the Army Medical Corps, right, you're going to see a lot more female soldiers. And if you're in something like the infantry, which only recently became open to women at all, you're going to see that number look more like 99-1 or 90, probably even greater than 99-1. Likewise, some bases are near fairly developed urban areas. The classic example being what's now called JBLM, what used to be Fort... I don't know. I don't remember its name, but it's Joint Base Lewis McChord. Oh, Fort Lewis. Duh. Yeah, JBLM is right in the Seattle-Tacoma metro area. But you also have places like in the Marine Corps 29 Palms. In the military has their adjacent training site called NTC, the National Training Center, and that is an hour outside of Barstow, California, which, if you've ever been to Barstow, you probably know is not a desirable place to meet anyone. I got lunch there driving to California, and boy howdy was I not pleased to meet just about anyone there. Just seemed like a really sketchy area. No offense to anyone from Barstow, though I did just insult your hometown pretty viciously. Listen, be a realist here, okay? I'm from Philly. You think there's an insult you could level against Philadelphia that I won't be like, yeah, there's some truth to that? Yeah, people from these towns know. Okay, so having established those 2 key facets of context to understand dating in the military, let's talk about the 2 places, again, as a single dude, that you can look for a romantic relationship. The first is inside the military. Now, inside the military has a whole bunch of problems, but some benefits. And I dated several women who were in the military, on active duty, right, stationed at the same base I was. And here are some of the issues. First, you know that a military partner, they're not going to be looking to get a hold of your benefits, or they're not going to be doing, gold digging. And that's because obviously they also have the same benefits and are earning the same professional salary you are. So it can be, in some ways, good to know that this is someone who isn't after you for your great health care or what looks like a really competitive salary for the area. And that can just make it a little easier to relax around someone, to be open to them. I'm sure this is sort of loosely how, like, celebrities, right? You ever notice celebrities always date each other and they almost never date fans? That's probably because it's almost impossible for them to know if a fan is just after them for money or clout or to turn around and write a tell-all book and make $1 million. And it's just easier to date other celebrities who aren't after you for those things. It allows you to be less guarded and your more authentic self. A sort of scaled down version also plays out in the military. Now, the other thing that makes dating in uniform, dating in uniform good is that the other person is going to get it. And by it, I mean the military culture, the military hours you often have to keep. For example, someone else in uniform is going to understand when you get a 4 a.m. phone call from your boss that says someone in a totally other platoon or totally other company has gotten a DUI, and now the entire battalion has to gather around, go report to work, and get lectured on why getting a DUI is bad, as though no one else noticed. And of course, you may be thinking, as an aside, wow, Paul, there are many weekends where, as a young 20-something, if I was awoken at 4 a.m., I may still be intoxicated. And fun fact, yep, that's a risk that these often battalion and company commanders totally understand and still just do anyway. This is because the military is often stupid. Now, obviously, you can imagine if you have a spouse, let's say, or young kids at home, or you're just with your girlfriend, right? Imagine how she is going to react when you get a 4 a.m. phone call on a Sunday morning and you have to leave and you're potentially gone until noon that day. Whatever plans you had just got scrapped. So if you are dating someone else in the military, they're going to go, haha, you have to deal with this, knowing full well that in the future they will probably have to deal with it too. In contrast, a civilian who has a civilian perspective of jobs and working might say, but you're not on today. Sunday or Saturday, it's your day off. You're not supposed to be in work. Well, you're never really off when it comes to the military. And so that can be a source of conflict. Similarly, right, you get 1 week's notice that you're going to be going to the National Training Center, or you're going to have to go to some training course somewhere because the original person got sick, right? And you get a week's notice and you're going to be gone for 6 weeks. And that is business as usual in the military. And someone else who's in the military is going to totally understand that. Someone who isn't may not. They may find it confusing and annoying that these sort of things come up oftentimes several times a year. Now, those are some of the perks. The downsides are considerable. First off, and most notably, the military has a very strict set of rules regarding what it calls fraternization. And fraternization is classically refers to romantic relationships, but it can be any sort of outside the military, extra-military relationship that could compromise the effectiveness of the chain of command. So that can include, for example, and often the most clear, the brightest line in fraternization is between the officer corps. Those are commissioned officers who have usually completed college, and begin their career as lieutenants, go on to captains, majors, lieutenant colonels, and the enlisted. Those are generally the people that join right out of high school. They start as privates, become and rise to varying levels of sergeant, staff sergeant, first sergeant, command sergeant major, etc. And that line is very bright. Fraternizing between officers and enlisted is extremely illegal, and the standards for violating fraternization regulations are very, very high, or very low, excuse me. And that means that, for example, let's say I wanted to launch a power washing business, make a little money on the side, power washing my neighbors' siding and driveways. And I asked my NCO buddy, who I know from work, who also needs a little extra money and has a pickup truck, if he wants to help me out on these jobs. Well, the answer is, under military regulations, with a tiny number of exceptions, you cannot do that, right? That is considered fraternization because you two have launched a business together, and that could compromise the chain of command if you know, for example, that your business partner has a job that weekend. Maybe you as an officer won't call in your entire platoon to yell at them because someone else got a DUI or whatever. Right? These are the sort of potential pitfalls that you run into with fraternization across the board. But it also applies within the chain of command. So even if I had, say, if I was a captain with, say, a lieutenant working for me, another officer, right, there are certain types of prohibited activities there as well. For example, I would probably be prohibited from also launching a business venture with them outside of work, but the standards are a little bit looser. For example, I probably couldn't invite my NCO I couldn't invite just the NCOs I liked to come to my house and barbecue and have a beer. That would probably be considered inappropriate. It may be okay for me to invite, as a captain, to invite, say, some of the other staff lieutenants to have a beer and grill, right? Because it's seen as something that's happening kind of among officers. It's a little bit looser. Again, it can still, it's subjective, right? And there's still absolutely ways. If, for example, the lieutenant that you rate the absolute worst, and you give the worst assignments to, and you never invite them to any of the barbecues, they may have a case to say, hey, actually, I think this captain has an inappropriate level of fraternization with the other lieutenants to the exclusion of me. Again, it gets into some different regulatory issues, but you should understand that the bright line between officer and enlisted is strong, and the bright line reflecting the chain of command is very strong. So what does that mean? That means that the coworkers you spend the most time with, right, statistically the ones you're most likely to embark on a romantic relationship with, they are the ones you are most likely to be prohibited from ever dating. Now, when I dated one fellow officer in my battalion, but we were not in the same chain of command, and that's what made it okay. That we were also both lieutenants, so it was not that big a deal. That said, the ultimate downside is that the dating pool is small, and while dating is not a market, right? It isn't. There isn't an exchange of goods and services for money, hopefully, but what it does have is some market-like characteristics, and one of those characteristics is supply and demand. At the end of the day, no one wants, everyone wishes they could just hold out their entire lives for their Prince Charming or their Princess Cinderella, but reality gets a vote, and you're going to, you're not going to be able to hold out for this perfect person. Instead, you look at who's available, who you like, who you kind of vibe with, and those are the people you're going to pursue romantically. That means that when you have you have 4 men for every 1 woman or so, that the competition is going to be stiff. People who are more attractive, more charismatic than you are going to be competing, for lack of a better word, are going to be available for, again, female soldiers to date, or rather, your female peers basically to date. So often you can sit there and be like, okay, there are 3 soldiers that are not in my chain of command, are not enlisted, are not, who I don't have this, like, who are not otherwise taken, right? Who aren't already married or with partners, etc. And so you can literally be like, okay, there's 3, and I know for a fact there's a dozen other guys, but also there's a chance that you might just be like, all 3 of them, I'm just not feeling it. Maybe some of them are cool, but you're just not into it. Maybe some of them you're like, if I have to hear this person talk, I will lose my damn mind. It depends. But the point is that when you have this small pool, right, your ability to even select, like your options are so very small that your willingness to, your ability to find someone who you really click with and is worth your time and effort to you, can be tough. Can be really, really pretty tough. Especially if you're in a specialty that has even fewer women officers, or women, right? Infantry, tankers, etc. Now, let's talk about the other option. The other option is to date outside the military. Now, this has its own pitfalls. The biggest of which, as we talked about, is the fact that in many of these areas where military bases are located, the socioeconomic conditions for local residents are really, really, really poor. And this is a function of the fact that these bases go often on, they're often placed in areas that could use the economic boost, that don't have much other industry, and they're placed in areas that, frankly, no private sector developer wants to buy for anything. I mean, literally, imagine a place that's so barren that even Walmart doesn't want to put a warehouse there. That's how sort of available this government land is. A lot of times these bases have been around for, like, in Fort Riley, the base had been around since like the 1880s. So it's not always like that, but at some point that land was seen as being really undesirable. And oftentimes it's still the case. So that means that when you have this tremendous, massive disparity between service members who receive a regular paycheck, but also receive totally free health care and receive robust retirement benefits after just 20 years. So if you sign up after college, you will retire with full health care and pension benefits at 38 years old, right? And if you sign up at 22 as an officer, 42 years of age, and you are headed out of the military. So when you have these sort of benefits available, right, it also includes things like subsidized and free childcare. It includes, free relocation expenses. Obviously, even some job placement programs for spouses, since it's very hard to find work opportunities in many military bases. The appeal, right? The appeal of this sort of sudden ability to leap 2 or 3 rungs up the socioeconomic ladder, gain access to opportunity and to resources that aren't otherwise available, makes the makes dating a military member very appealing to a certain type of person, right? And we don't need to pretend that we live in some society that we don't, right? Look at the number of professional athletes or professional musicians where they very much acknowledge that women attempt to sleep with them in order to get pregnant to receive large child support payments, often making more money per month than they typically make in a year. I think recently the rapper Drake was in the news because I guess a woman disclosed that he took some steps. I won't spoil it for you, but if you Google Drake and hot sauce, you will see he has started taking some steps to ensure that, potential partners don't attempt to, get pregnant without him knowing. But this is pretty typical, right? And this is, again, a scaled down version of that, where you try to sort of engage in something close to manipulation of these military members in order to garner the benefits. Oh yeah, you can also get, spouses can also get their tuition paid for through the GI Bill. So yeah, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars of benefits are up for grabs if you can marry a military member. And that can make dating really tough, because you have to always ask yourself, is this person genuine, or are they putting on a facade in order to manipulate me? And that can really make dating suck, right? I have been on dates where I, again, with civilian, like non-military local people, and it was bizarre. I had one where this person appeared to be screening me for my openness to, I don't know, getting serious very quickly. And when I kind of was like, no, I'm not looking to like get married anytime soon. Like, I'm looking for someone to date. You know, I'm not like not a player, but I'm not looking to settle down in the next year. She began to order, basically, I'm going to say she ordered about $150 worth of food, ate all of it, and left, leaving me with the bill. It was pretty weird and pretty trashy. And I, for one, was like, $150 to dodge that bullet is A-okay. But it's a real risk. The other risk, like we talked about, is that they aren't in the military culture. They may be pretty upset when you get that 4 a.m. phone call on a Saturday morning, or when you get 1 week's notice that you're going away for 6 weeks. And not to say anything of the potential for deployments of a year plus. These are the sort of issues that you can have, right? And they may not understand, because they only have a conception of work and employment from their own or their parents' experiences, where a job is something you do 40 hours a week and then you go home. Even things like, again, the fraternization regulations, where you may have to say, I'm sorry, honey, you can hang out with such and such, but I can't because they're an NCO in my chain of command. So you can't actually have these people like that. You know, you can't have our neighbors over for a barbecue or whatever. Again, there's some exceptions, and that probably is going to be one of them, but the potential exists. The potential exists for those issues. And that is something that a civilian may not understand. Now, the other thing that is actually a deterrent. Now, this may surprise some people. The reputation of the military among people who are local is really, really poor. And that is simply because the military, well, they recruit young, oftentimes unattached men, oftentimes that aren't really college bound, and they give them a lot of disposable income. So you can imagine the sort of immature behaviors they engage in. You buy your coal rolling overpriced truck or your Dodge Charger at 28% interest rate, and you drag race it up and down the street. You go out and drink and get in fights at bars because you feel like you're a tough guy. And again, when you and the closest 35 of your buddies are all single, it can produce some, you guys can go a little ham. All of those things serve to cement the reputation of military men as being trashy, violent, and not really great dating material. So much so that often the women will just not date military members, period, full stop. And that is, of course, their prerogative, right? It's obviously true. I dated a fair amount of civilian women, but I was definitely conscious of the fact that I was always working against that. I was always working against that stereotype. And again, I had the advantage of, I was a college graduate, I was a little older, I never really got big into the drinking, partying, raging sort of mentality. And so oftentimes if I could get a date for an hour or two, they would realize, hey, this guy's a little bit, he's definitely not the like Affliction t-shirt, tattoos, and Monster Energy drinks that I'm used to seeing at bars. Now, the other biggest upside to dating civilians is it's just less regulated, right? Your dating pool is going to almost always be larger than the military, and your ability to meet someone is just going to be a lot easier because you don't have these sort of fraught fraternization regulations that you're subject to. And so overall, as a military member, here's what I will say. You can definitely date. No doubt about it. There's a lot of people who believe that you have to live like a monk, and I'm sure there's places where that's the case. But for me, like I said, in my 5-ish years on active duty, I dated casually, seriously. Did I ever really date that seriously? Yeah, I dated kind of seriously. But, I dated probably more civilians than military, but I definitely dated both. And for me, again, as someone who is like kind of picky in terms of who I dated, I think I did very well. I always felt like I could always eventually find a partner whom I liked. Eventually, but you got to put yourself out there, and you got to be willing to take some risks and be willing to, put in the work. That said, there's a lot of times where I have seen some crazy stuff, and I'll share one of these stories with you guys. So this happened after I left active duty. I had a friend of mine. I was actually a friend of my brother's. My brother was stationed at the base the same time I was, so we would actually live together and hung out, and it was really cool. But he had a friend of his from his unit, and she was an active duty officer. She was married to a guy she met in her university in Florida, and he was a nice guy. Just kind of wasn't clear what he did all day. Again, didn't really have a job lined up. Had applied for a PhD program in counseling. Just a decent, nice guy. Anyway, she deployed to Kuwait, right, which is not a war zone. So it meant that there's often a lot of free time. And it's sort of like when you deploy to a non-war zone, you have to find ways to keep your unit busy. But it's a lot of just that, busy work. And she worked for the command team. She worked directly for the battalion commander and the battalion sergeant major. And as an assistant, an adjutant is how it's sometimes called. And there was, of course, an enlisted equivalent who was sort of like a secretary. And the sergeant major and the battalion commander were both men. And, of course, the adjutant and the secretary were both women. This is already not a great look because the military officially, there is no job that is secretary. There's some administrative personnel, but that is a broad job set that includes things like pay, personnel, administration, all the paperwork. There is no job that is secretary, and there is no job. There is adjutant or assistant, but it is a role you fill. It is not your primary job. So to assign those jobs to only women is already sort of getting dangerously close to a line. Now, what became more problematic is that often the command team would begin to travel to other regions of the area, often for meetings, and they would take their adjutant and their secretary. And it became increasingly fraught because they began to book hotel rooms, oftentimes in very nice resorts, and those trips became more and more and more frequent. And when some junior enlisted folk or junior officers said, hey, I think this may actually be problematic. This is not a good look. This battalion commander and sergeant major are traveling with two young women at a really high frequency. It just doesn't look very professional. And that battalion commander called and threatened the careers of those people who reported him and or expressed concerns, sometimes in ways that were pretty creepy, like calling their cell phone late at night or calling these one-on-one meetings at weird hours. Not a pretty worrying set of circumstances. But lo and behold, it came out that the officer, my friend, was sleeping with the enlisted sergeant major while the enlisted secretary was sleeping with the officer battalion commander. So boy, did they sort out things all bananas. everything. They were afoul of fraternization regulations in several different ways. It was honestly pretty impressive. And because some of these hotels were actually in 5-star resorts and didn't appear to be aligned with any particular mission, it meant that they may have also committed a level of financial fraud. The Army took extreme displeasure at finding this out, that such a high-level officer had such a poor moral compass. And last I heard, all of them had been forced out of the military, where my, I guess, former friend, I haven't talked to her in a decade, former friend is living with this sergeant major, having divorced her husband. So it was not a great way to go about finding a romantic partner. I also believe that the battalion commander may have also been married. So these are the sort of high drama that you run into when you have romantic relationships in a highly structured, highly regulated environment. And especially when you're isolated with one another, it's hard to stop those things from happening. If you guys are curious about more of it, I can talk a little bit about the lack of dating, I guess, when you're deployed and what those sort of dynamics played out as. But let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this. Be sure to follow me on Twitch. And until next time, I'll see you guys later.